Welcome to the Pitt Rivers Museum. My name is Andrew McClellan. This evening, our conversation, Let's Talk Labels, explores museum interpretation through the lens of artistic interventions. You're welcome to use the chat function. Please do introduce yourself and say where you're from. And of course, we would love you to ask questions. There's a separate chat Q&A function to do that. I'll collect them together and pose as many as I can in the Q&A at the end of the conversation. The talk should last for just over 1 hour. Our speakers today, Royce and Daisy, are in Hong Kong, while Eiko is in Japan. So we've recorded the conversation in advance, as they're currently fast asleep, probably. But we will have a live Q&A at the end with Marenka Thompson-Odlum, a Pitt Rivers Research Associate, and the museum's director, Laura van Broekhoven. So please do put questions into the Q&A in the chat. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. This event is a place for listening and learning and for conversation. And of course, we welcome comments in the chat so that everyone can feel safe in taking part. We would ask you to be considerate of your fellow audience members and panelists. Please keep your comments polite. Tonight's conversation, funded by Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, will be recorded and shared online after the event. Keep your eyes open. There will be a survey coming and we'd love to have your feedback. So, with no further ado, straight over to my colleague Marenka and her guests.
Welcome everyone and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Marenka Thompson-Odlum and I'm the researcher on the Labeling Matters project at the Pitt Rivers Museum. The project was conceived as part of the Pitt Rivers Museum's commitment to rethink the ethics of representations made in the museum's galleries and its intention to be a welcoming space to all. The project aims to identify areas of improvement and to trial ways of challenging or changing our public text where derogatory and other problematic language is used. The project can be broken down into 2 initial phases. First, a review of both visual and textual aspects of the Pitt Rivers Museum's permanent display cases, as well as web-based microsites. This phase hinges on fully understanding the various ways coloniality is presented within the PRM's interpretation. For this, I relied on the decolonial theory of the colonial matrix of power, described by scholars such as Annabelle Criano, Walter Mignolo, and Catherine Walsh. I adapted the colonial matrix of power model so that I could literally physically map the process of coloniality occurring within each display. In a nutshell, I used this methodology to question our process of producing knowledge, our reiteration of hierarchies and stereotypes rooted in colonialism, and the ways we impose Eurocentric cultural norms. For a more in-depth explanation of this part of the project, please listen to the podcast link that has been posted in the chat, and we will discuss a little further in the second half of the webinar. However, our first 3 speakers are looking more at the second phase of the project, which aims to move beyond the deconstruction of colonial narratives and reimagine the definition of labeling and find innovative ways of interpretation to challenge the traditional narratives of our current displays. Part of this also means to activate and mobilize the old labels to address and illustrate the problematic systemic colonial legacies that linger in the present. The second phase is not possible without the first phase, without a thorough understanding of how we continuously and sometimes unconsciously hold up and centralize colonial and Eurocentric ideologies. This failure to imagine or reimagine museum interpretation can be summed up by 2 processes. A limitation in how we produce and disseminate knowledge, and an underestimation and misunderstanding of our audience. To the first point, I ask, how as an anthropological museum with collections from across the globe and from varied cultural groups, do we expect to showcase and talk about these objects utilizing only Western forms of communication, i.e. privileging written, historical, and curatorial text presented in an often third-person omniscient voice, especially as some of these objects, these possessions, are best understood by using source ways of knowing. However, the idea of embedding multiple knowledge forms as interpretation within museum spaces is often met with concern that our audience will get confused and not understand the interpretation. This brings me to my second point. We often treat our audience as a monolithic group once they enter museum doors, as though they all experience a museum space in the same way. However, that universality that we prescribe to our visitors is a fallacy. Everyone embodies and thus experiences the museum differently, yet our interpretation does not reflect this. A reimagining of labeling is not about a chaos of interpretation, although there's a little bit of that happening, but it is also about creating a space where we always question and challenge ourselves and our visitors, because it's only by doing so that we can hope that we don't fall into the same traps, hope that everyone can find something to connect with within the museum walls. While preparing for this webinar with the speakers and talking about the notion of always questioning and challenging, the words uncanny and unexpected came up. As a museum that houses and cares for material culture from many cultures, I often try to stay away from words such as uncanny because they are often used to describe the objects in the museum. But more importantly, they are used to frame and describe the other within the museum space and reinforce harmful stereotypes. If you don't believe me, take a look at our TripAdvisor reviews. The posts there consist of 175 uniques, 150 quirkies, 145 weirds, 130 unusuals, 60 strange, 40 curious, 25 mysterious, 40 odds, 45 bizarre, 10 primitives, and 1 uncanny. However, today with the help of our guest speakers, Eiko Soga, Royce Ng, and Daisy Bisenieks, we hope to begin reclaiming the uncanny and investigate how the slightly unfamiliar and uncomfortable is not to be othered or feared, but can be a pathway to new interpretation. We are first going to hear from Eiko Soga. Eiko is a Japanese artist and researcher, currently reading for her DPhil at the Ruskin School of Art, University of Oxford. Her doctoral project combines video, poetry, and ethnography. She's currently doing fieldwork with the Ainu people in Hokkaido, Japan. Her fieldwork explores traditional Ainu cooking as a site of reciprocal empathy and seeks to unpack the interrelations among historical, cultural, emotional, and natural landscapes. In doing so, she moves away from the social and educational forms imposed by colonial and imperialistic norms. The heart of her work is cultivating a conversation about reforestation and decolonization for societies that have been shaped by urban capitalism-centric developments. I'm currently working with Eiko in multiple capacities. Her video art of making Ainu salmon skin boots has been extremely useful in explaining and teaching the concept of embodied knowledge as interpretation. The link to this video is available in the chat, as well as on the event registration page. I hope to acquire this video to act as an interpretation to a pair of Ainu skin boots collected in 1900 that are currently in the Pitt Rivers Museum. She's also aiding me in collecting contemporary Ainu pieces as part of the Art Fund New Collecting Award. Eiko, over to you.
Hello, thanks Marenka for wonderful introduction, and it's really interesting to know how you vision the future for the museum. As Marenka kindly introduced me, I'm currently reading for doctoral research at the Ruskin School of Art, and I'm now in Hokkaido, Japan, to carry out the field work. So I'm just going to switch my screen. I thought about what to present today, and instead of focusing on one specific project, I thought about showing my works I've done over last 5 to 6 years, to just show you how my thought process developed throughout different art projects that I carried out. The picture you're seeing now is an image from Samani town, where I'm based at now. And okay, so now this is, can you tell where this is? It's a picture of Japan, but centered around Hokkaido, which is the red island, upside down in a way. But this is kind of an experience I'm having in Hokkaido. Normally you'd see a map of Japan this way, and if you can see a little star, that's where I am now, in Hokkaido. The reason I showed you upside down image sort of represent my experience of coming to Hokkaido in 2015. I grew up in Tokyo as Japanese, so I've always learned, Tokyo is kind of center of the country, but as I came to Hokkaido, everything shifted. I learned so much about history that I was never taught in my school time. So my world kind of shifted so much. And yeah, so since 2015, I became more and more curious to learn about untold stories of Japanese culture, history, and personal stories of people I've never met before. So I think I'm just going to show you, how my journey started in Hokkaido, or how I started how my curiosity started. When I first went to Hokkaido, I kept seeing this shoe made out of salmon skin, and it looked so unusual and weird and beautiful and curious all at once. So I sort of became obsessed with it, and as I was visiting different museums in Hokkaido, I also saw many salmon swimming in the river. One day I saw a path and the divergence of the river. The right path was full of salmon still swimming back to where they came from, and the path on the left was full of dead salmon. And then I saw a life and death at the same time. And it was such an overwhelming experience. It's just sort of started to haunt me. So in 2016, I went back to Hokkaido and started living in Nibutani village, where I met an Ainu lady called Mrs. Katsue Kaizawa. So this lady in the center, she kindly taught me how to make Ainu kimono, embroidery, and salmon shoes, and this I centered making of the kimono as a main activity to be Nibutani, but it helped me to get to know people I wouldn't have met otherwise, and working on embroidery allowed me to spend a lot of time sitting down with other elders in silence, but occasionally we would chat and gossip and learned about history that never got written in books. I learned how in Ainu culture, salmon used to serve key economic, religious, and spiritual roles. And so as a result of my stay in Nibutani, I made about 20 minutes video work. And in this work, you see a text that I wrote about Ainu social phenomena centered on salmon. This research allowed me to explore a wider understanding of Ainu culture other than just kimono or fishing. It was a very eye-opening experience to understand how the storytelling is so political, and it gave me experience to think further about a form of storytelling and embodiment of other people's culture and feelings and how they are affected by societal pressure and norms. So that was my video work called Autumn Salmon. In 2018, I was invited to work and stay and work in Shiraoi in Hokkaido. This is about 1.5 hours to 2 hours from Nibutani. I participated in a residency program called Imam Art and Culture. And during this my stay in Shiraoi, I researched the historical, cultural, and ecological background of Nemagaridake. It's a type of bamboo that are thin and bent. You can see all the brown sticks on the ground in this picture are Nemagaridake. The man in the picture is called Mr. Toru Sone. He's a bamboo cutter. He works alone in the mountain. As I told him, I was interested in the Ainu mouse herb called muku. The Pitt Rivers have amazing collection of mouse herbs, and I think there are some Ainu ones too. I was always fascinated by the sound and a function of this tool as a messenger and connection between people's feelings and nature. And so Mr. Sone, and the Ainu muku is often made out of bamboo. So Mr. Sone took me to the mountain, and I learned using my body. I observed, through physical senses, I learned about the relationship between trees, bamboos, insect, birds, the sky, the weather, and all of this stuff shapes the experience of being in a mountain. As well as my experience of being in the mountain, I encountered both personal and historical narratives of the Japanese and Ainu in the town. Historical knowledge and people's stories often seem to me like a mountain landscape on clouded days, the truth often being unknowable. On sunny days, you can see a shape of mountain, but as you're, in the mountain, you don't see the whole picture. And on the rainy days, you just don't see the mountain at all. So I was quite interested in this experience of what is true. And I felt as a outsider coming to Shiraoi and, making Shiraoi as a temporary home. I felt like I was embodying an old radio machine tuning into the right channel. So I made a video work called Tuning Bamboo. This is Mr. Sone working with bamboo. And this is the video work I made. I documented the process of working in the mountain, Mr. Sone working in the mountain, and myself trying to make the muku. Once I make video works, I often show them at exhibitions and conferences and film screening events. So this is one of the installation shots from the art festival called Benizakura Art Annual in Japan. And this next work is called Ein Hunter Monchan. As the title of the video suggests, that Monchan is a protagonist. This man in orange jacket is Monchan. And I met him when I was working with Mrs. Kaizawa in Nibutani in 2016. And Monchan and our mutual friends and I used to go fishing and going on walks and talking about complication and social issues that makes practicing of Ainu culture difficult. We often talked about the idea of ecology from Ainu culture's perspectives. And I started to understand why it's so difficult for Monchan to hunt in traditional Ainu way, which he was working really hard to pursue. In 2019, I finally had chance to follow him and go hunting in a mountain. Prior to this experience, I read about Ain hunting to figure out how the Ain hunting is different from general hunting. So I've read books and researched through text in the museums, but I kind of really didn't. I understood what's being written, and the tools Aina people used to use and how hunting was done, but I didn't understand the spiritual aspect of it. But going into the mountain and see Monjan hunting sort of gave me abstract and emotional understanding of it. So I wanted to make video work about that, as well as ecology of conversation and words, because as I was going back to a city where I lived, I felt that Monchan's thoughts and feelings have somehow become part of myself. So I made a video about that. And now I'm currently in a town called Samani and learning traditional Ainu cooking from a lady called Mrs. Kane Kumagai. And she's known to be one of the last people to hold genuine Ainu traditional knowledge and skill set. So I work with her every month to learn seasonal Ainu cooking. I see traditional Ainu cooking as a site or space to exchange reciprocal empathy and unpack historical, cultural, emotional, and natural landscape of this place. So this is the sea where people get kelp, and Mrs. Kumagai taught me how to make a kelp Ainu dish. I work with fishermen to understand the ecology of the sea, and then I go home and cook with Mrs. Kumagai. So those processes give me holistic understanding of relationship between landscape and human culture. Ainu cooking is known to be ecological and inclusive. So yeah, cooking really teaches me the materiality of nature as well. And Ainu people used to have knowledge of how the cycle of nature. So we, myself and Mrs. Kumagai, often work outside to gain sensory understanding of things that make our lives. And at the moment, I'm using photography and poetry to capture or explore how artwork can document felt knowledge of more than human communication among the Ainu culture. So I hope, I'm still in the middle of the process, how words and images can support this kind of knowledge that is ephemeral and fragile and fleeting, which is very important part of what makes our culture. I just want to finish off by showing the image of the mountain in Samani called Mount Apoi. Going to mountain is a part of research too, as well as going to the sea. But this was such a big challenge for me to walk on this quite harsh natural environment. And after walking in this mountain, I also saw a bear getting dissected. I'm against hunting, but these experiences gave me a deeper understanding towards spirituality of the Ainu culture. So I like to just end with a picture of a bear. This deer knew I wasn't the enemy, so it paused for me. And as soon as I finished taking photograph, it just walked off. So yes, this is a journey of myself trying to understand Ainu culture that hasn't, been part of my knowledge for most of my life. But trying to understand Ainu culture really opened up ideas about the world, ideas about nature, and so I'm so honored and humbled to be having this conversation with Marenka and Royce and today. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was great. I mean, I love when you said the shape of the mountain being unknowable. We'll come back to that later.
Oh, sorry, and I forgot to mention, Daisy is here with us today as well.
Yes, we can't forget Daisy.
Yes, very important.
That being said, now we're going to go over to Royce Ng and Daisy Bisenieks. Royce is an artist currently based in Hong Kong, working in digital media and performance, who deals with the intersections of modern Asian history, transnational trade, drugs, technology, and aesthetics, and who works with anthropologist Daisy Bisenieks in the collective Zheng Mala. Since 2015, he has been working on the Opium Museum, a series of performances which look at the role of opium and the development of modern Asian states. From 2013 to 2016, he was an artist in residence at the Johann Jacobs Museum in Zurich with Bisenieks, where they produced the exhibitions on the economic relationship between Africa and Asia in a season of Shell 2014 and Mutual Aid 2016. Royce has also worked with me on a recent intervention exposing the problematic way we currently talk about opium or don't talk about it within the opium display case at the Pitt Rivers. He created a video essay that explored the global interconnectivity of the opium trade, which simultaneously shone a light on the inadequacy and truncated narrative of our own displays. So yeah, over to you.
So Royce, I think you can start first.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Eiko. I'm going to try to do this. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes, yeah.
So the intervention I produced for the Pitt Rivers Museum as a part of the Labeling Matters project was a continuation or kind of a summary of the last chapter of the projected trilogy I've been working on about the relationship of opium to the development of the modern Asian state. The first part of this trilogy, which has taken the form of performances, looked at the Japanese colony of Manchukuo in Northeast Asia, which existed as a puppet sovereign state from the 1920s and 1930s up until 1945. And essentially is looking at the Japanese opium monopoly, which was operated by the Imperial Japanese government. And the second part of the trilogy is looking at Southeast Asia, specifically the Golden Triangle, this kind of nexus of poppy growing being processed into heroin, which began in the late 1950s and carried over until the 1990s, which was centered around intersections of northeast Thailand and southern Myanmar, or as it was known at the time, Burma, Laos, and Vietnam. And the last chapter of the trilogy, which is as yet unfinished, but which my intervention was the kind of gesture towards, or a prologue towards, will be about Hong Kong, which is where I'm currently based. And so looking at the history of opium in Hong Kong, which is a kind of important history, maybe in relation to kind of origins of the Pitt Rivers Museum and its collection, and British colonialism and the British East India Company, and the origins of Hong Kong itself as a kind of formed as a kind of spoil of the Opium Wars, and which I argue conditions many elements of its current situation, politically and economically. But just to kind of travel back to the origins of the project, and touching on some of these topics about the uncanny, and how we learn history, and how one understands and reads history, and on a really basic level, how does one come from a position of ignorance to kind of knowledge and kind of deeper engagement with these various histories, which are not necessarily taught to us in schools or even universities? What is that process? And I thought I'd begin with like the kind of chance encounter with like a kind of uncanny, which unraveled this kind of story for me, which was I was in New York in 2015, and I was wandering through the Lower East Side, and I came across this statue in Chatham Square, which is just on the outskirts of Chinatown. And there was a statue, quite large, of what was apparently some kind of Chinese official. And it seemed a bit out of place, as you can see, even though it's on the edge of Chinatown. You can see the background of these skyscrapers, and then this kind of unexpected encounter with what I would later find out was a Qing dynasty official. And the even stranger thing was when I approached the statue and came closer and looked at the plaque at the base, it had the phrase, "Don't do drugs." And something, I mean, I was just, it was completely inexplicable to me. And I also noticed that this statue was facing actually the Manhattan Detention Complex, which is also known as the Tombs. So one of the main kind of prison complexes in lower New York. And so basically it was from that I went home and did some research. I found out the name of the official was Lin Zexu, and that he was a Qing dynasty official who was sent by the Kangxi Emperor in the early 19th century to essentially sort out the problem going on in southern China, in Guangdong, in Shamian Island, in this kind of trading port between the East and the West. Essentially, British opium smugglers were bringing copious amounts, exorbitant amounts of opium into the country, into China. and it was opium that was coming from the poppy plantations in India, cultivated by the British East India Company. And this kind of push for opium was a result of an attempt to balance the kind of trade deficit that the British had with China. Basically, there was a central problem that the British wanted luxury goods from China, tea, porcelain, and silk. But the Chinese wanted nothing from the British. And there are these famous kind of historical episodes, the McCartney Embassy, where they tried to impress the Chinese emperor with the wonders of the British Empire and the Industrial Revolution, and the emperor was duly unimpressed. And so this was one way for the British to kind of balance that trade deficit, and by pushing opium into the country. And I mean, I grew up in Australia. I'm Australian, but with an ethnic Chinese background, and this is a history that my parents may have like kind of droned into me, but I purposely blocked out as a child. But it's something which was almost, completely unknown to me. And the more I delved into this history, the more interesting it became, and the more pervasive it became, this kind of phenomenon. The second fact is reading about the Opium War itself, that essentially what Lin Zexu did was that he confiscated all this opium from the British and destroyed it, and that triggered the first Opium War. Basically, the British declaring war against China because China had destroyed the illegal opium and they were smuggling in the country. And I just think for a contemporary kind of analogy would be if there were an Australian drug smuggler who was caught in Indonesia bringing, cocaine in his suitcase, and then for him to somehow be released and then go back to the Australian government and petition the government to wage war against Indonesia and to get back his opium, which is essentially what happened in the Opium Wars. And then living in Hong Kong, finding out that there was a opium monopoly, a state-run opium monopoly operated by the British colonial government in Hong Kong up until 1945, and that this opium monopoly was the majority, the source of the income, the GDP for the colony for the first 100 years of its existence, up until the end of the war, when they replaced it with horse racing. And that reading about this led me to researching about the Japanese opium monopoly in Northeast China. The Japanese did a similar thing with their colonial kind of enterprise, setting up poppy plantations, forcing workers to work on the Chinese workers to work on these plantations, and then at the same time selling that opium back to the workers themselves as this kind of circular labor of death. And then it became, following that trail of sticky black liquid of the opium poppy through history, through Asian history, until the mid 20th century, when essentially you could jump to this point in time when the Chinese Communist Party was taking over after it defeated Japan, and they pushed the nationalists, the Republicans, who would eventually escape to Taiwan. But there was one kind of lost army which decided not to surrender to the communists, and they crossed the border of Western China into Myanmar. And to cut a long story short, there was the beginning of the Cold War, and so the US decided to fund these Chinese nationalists in Myanmar, and as a means to kind of buttress the expansion of communism in Southeast Asia. But what they did was the Republicans took this money and used it to develop the immense poppy plantations, a natural crop that was growing in these mountainous regions. of northeast Burma at the time in collaboration or with the local hill tribes. And that this became the origins of what was later known as the Golden Triangle. And the Golden Triangle became the source of this high-grade heroin, which would then make its way to the West through US Vietnam veterans returning back to the streets of Manhattan. And this kind of drug epidemic would lead to the declaration by Nixon in '73, the war on drugs. And that I found, like, doing this research, I found this kind of circular symmetrical historical moments told a narrative in themselves, and this kind of became the catalyst for exploring this research. So just to go back to the work itself, it culminated in the first piece called Kishi the Vampire, which was essentially me telling this story about Manchukuo and the opium monopoly. That expanded that into a larger piece called Ghost of Showa in 2017. And the second part of the trilogy, Queen Zomia, focused on Olive Young, who was a transsexual warlord who and also part of the Burmese royalty, who was responsible for the beginnings of the opium trade in that region. And that kind of led to the unfinished part of the trilogy concerning the history of opium in Hong Kong. But yeah, I think I've spoken for long enough, so I think I'll hand it over to Daisy to speak about another one of our projects, which I think intimately relates to Marenka's project at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Marenka. Yeah, so I'm going to just talk briefly about one particular work Royce and I worked on, and it has more to do with exhibition making within the museum context, and it's kind of specifically touches on this idea of uncanny that we're talking about, and we'll discuss further. So I'll begin. So Royce and I, we were commissioned back in 2013 by the Johann Jakobs Museum in Zurich, Switzerland. We were kind of the first artist researcher collaborations in their new kind of reimagined museum program after they went through a series of renovations. And they were looking to engage more with like the ideas around global trade and processes and the cultures around that. And that was due to its own private collections and history involved in coffee and cocoa trading. So we were tasked with looking at the cultural residues of economic trade between African nations and Asia, particularly China, where we were located in terms of Hong Kong, given our previous personal and professional backgrounds and experiences in both contexts. And so, yeah, we had moved to Hong Kong actually to begin this research, and we decided to do fieldwork in one particular building called the Chungking Mansions, which is an interesting hub for low-end globalization and trade between China and African countries. And here we met and befriended a Somali businessman and asylum seeker who we discovered actually was organizing Somali fishermen into cooperatives to sustainably fish for abalone in the Red Sea, after he had actually identified a gap in the Hong Kong market due to the reduction of trade with Japan following the Fukushima fallout. And interestingly, he had Japanese armor diver tapes translated into English and then Somali to train fishermen on how to fish for abalone, which for Somalis, he told us, were considered cockroaches of the sea and held no cultural or culinary value to Somalis. Yet he recognized the immense value that it held for Chinese people here in Hong Kong. So I think it was around after 6 months of field work, we were asked to create an exhibition with 2 weeks notice. So we decided instead of just presenting a series of documents and field notes, dry field notes, which were really the only material things we possessed at that point in time. We looked at presenting a real-time field report, and in consideration of the materialities that were circulating within the spaces we were operating in with our colleague, as well as the museum's history and interest and active role in the process of global trade, particularly existing in this idea of value adding chains. Like, you know, as a museum, both culturally and economically, they're very much entwined in this idea of value adding chains. So we really decided to activate and implicate the museum and take the bold measure of including the museum within the actual trade we were observing. So specifically moving the shucked abalone meat from Somalia to Hong Kong, which was sold door to door from restaurants, and the nakra, or the mother of pearl, which was sold onto China, and interestingly enough was sold onto Swiss watchmakers and jewelry makers. And at the time, our colleague was in the midst of organizing a shipment of 2 tons of abalone shells to move from the Horn of Africa to China. And so together with his help and his approval, we rerouted the shipment to stop at the museum for the duration of the exhibition. And we filled the entire basement exhibition space with what we ended up discovering were uncleaned, very smelly abalone shells. And this was presented alongside a short video, kind of documentary scraps, and a 10-part prose poem in the form of of a hell scroll. And that was which detailed our entanglement and a layering of like what we found parallel narratives. So, and this included the life cycle of the abalone, its own trading journey from the floor bed to the banquet tables of Chinese restaurants, the personal migration journey of our Somali colleague, and the research journey we shared together in this process of making this exhibition. And we found that the biography of the 18th century Surrealist poet Arthur Rimbaud was quite uncannily similar to the personal biography of our Somali colleague, and his own, and Rimbaud's famous Season in Hell poem became an interesting framework to encapsulate a lot of the research and actually help digest and kind of sift through a lot of the emotional and the challenging things that we all kind of encountered, including the difficulty of trying to co-write this poem with our Somali colleague, who was also came from a family of poets, and the difficulty around that because at one point he disappeared and we couldn't finish it. So we found the framework, A Season in Hell, became a really interesting way to really process a lot of the stuff that often gets left out of kind of more positivist, kind of objective anthropological writing, academic writing. Yeah, and I should note actually one of the striking things about doing this exhibition and trying to move 2 tons of abalone shells from Somalia through the Middle East, through Europe, to eventually onto Zurich, was we did all our best to get it arrive on time for the opening night, and actually we had no shells on the opening night, so the entire exhibition was empty. So we ended up having this kind of roundtable discussion around the void of this exhibition space, trying to dissect and discuss the intricacies of what it meant doing this exhibition, and unpacking all of that, and the realities of the trade and things. And we had a Hong Kong chef who was based in Switzerland prepare abalone soup for audience to taste, as we were having this shared discussion between the audience and the museum staff and us and a few other speakers who could share their views on what was happening. And the interesting thing, I think, through this that night was like we had a few audience members come up, say, and actually reiterate to us, and they said how disturbing a lot of this trade was, And we didn't know whether it was the distaste of actually tasting the abalone soup, which was probably quite foreign to Swiss palates. And then that was kind of further confirmed or reinforced by the fact that when the shells did arrive the next day, and we've discovered that they were extremely smelly, and filling up the whole basement space of that, of just sacks and sacks of abalone shells. The smell of having that in a museum space and confined museum space, in a new museum space and a Swiss museum space where it escaped any form of containment, it really challenged people's patience and olfactory senses. And it was quite confronting, I think, for a lot of people, and they really struggled with it, and it was very disturbing. But then after some time, like just through conversations that came later, we found that it was the sensory elements of both having the shells in the space, of being quite suffocating, the smell that couldn't be contained of decaying abalone stuck in the shells, and then also just the desire to handle the both the equally ugly and beautiful shell, the abalone shell, and even pocket it. It really drove home the disturbance and the discomfort that came with trying to organize these kind of exhibitions, the sensory realities around the trade. So thinking about how the shells are passed through so many different hands, or how they pass through different spaces, and actually being implicated in that, and what that means when they take it home or they put it on their office desk and things like that. So yeah, I think it was the sensory experiences of organizing this exhibition around trade was really opened up new ways of engaging with museum spaces and with material artifacts that move through museum spaces or come to be shared in the work and life of the staff and the artists, and also the audience. So I think that's probably as much as I should talk about, so we can have a discussion about everything.
Stop sharing.
We're missing somebody. Thank you so much. That was, I mean, I was partly kind of laughing, picturing the smell and everyone's, the way you described it.
It was equally comedic and disturbing at the same time.
By the way, I'm here, but
I know.
Okay.
Just have to start your video. Yeah, there
All
you
right.
go. No worries. Yeah, I mean, I think you guys all did the Uncanny proud. And I really almost don't know where to start, because I was writing notes so furiously, and there was just so much that I really wanted to unpack and talk about. And Daisy, I know that you might have to run soon.
I think I can try and squeeze in a few more minutes, because this is too interesting to not talk about.
No, yeah, it's really, and I definitely see so many kind of similarities between all the projects. I just kind of wanted to maybe just start off with asking, so a lot of all your work that you've kind of usually is in a more of exhibition and kind of this where we say temporary kind of spaces, and I hate saying permanent and temporary, just because I think museums have this thing about permanence a lot, and and I don't like that idea. But for the sake of thinking of the Pitt Rivers, that does have a temporary exhibition space and our permanent displays. I was thinking, how do you think all of your works can really be inputted or embedded, I should say, in the entire process of the permanent displays as well? Because you said, Daisy, about implicating the museum in the actual trade, and a lot of times museums kind of take themselves away from that. They're a place to kind of view these issues, but not really, I guess, not really engage, but not really put themselves as an institution within that whole linked history. And so
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, a lot of my work is how do I embed this into like the core? And if you want to say permanent displays, we can see that, but how do we embed it into like our kind of the core of how we do everything, not just our temporary exhibitions? So if anybody has any ideas about that, please go ahead.
I really liked, I loved the Black Panther. You know, that kind of opening scene in the museum where he just kind of smashes the display. It's a kind of act of violence. But I think just from our own experience, like, I don't think this is maybe necessarily applicable to Pitt Rivers Museum, but there is an element of biting the hand that feeds you, of kind of we nearly single-handedly destroyed the museum in its first exhibition with that show, like testing their kind of logistical and infrastructural capacities. Like we broke their dishwasher, their brand new Swiss dishwasher, putting shells in there, trying to clean them so that they wouldn't stink so much for the refined.
It didn't help in the end either.
It didn't help. It just stunk up it smelled like rotten clams through the whole museum and clogged up the dishwasher. So I think, that real implication of the museum, like it's not, I think for me and maybe Daisy, it's like sometimes it's good to go beyond the symbolic and into the real, like you don't need to be necessarily polite about the way you implicate the museum, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the challenge of dealing with museums who are still stuck with permanent collections. I mean, I think in terms of how anthropology at least can function with these museum contexts, like what we're seeing now, and maybe in Pitt Rivers is a perfect example, and the Johann Jacobs Museum is another example, although they're quite different. There's a real sense of like practicing an anthropology of museums where you can at least, there should be an encouragement to reflexively process the different contexts of those museums, and as Western cultural phenomenon, and thoughtfully interrogating individual institutions, and every institution is going to be different, and I guess it's responding to those differences. And I think what you're doing in the Pitt Rivers Museum is a great example where you can bring people culturally connected to the artifacts to reimagine or rethink the representation, expand on those narratives, add to those narratives, change those narratives, challenge all those narratives, because that's what it means. So, and particularly when I think in relation to our exhibition at the Johann Jacobs Museum, where there's still a lot of baggage around the privilege of exhibitions focusing on objects that are still embedded in, visually oriented experiences. And how do you deal with like changing those or shifting those to different sensory experiences? So, museums are famous for like putting things in glass boxes, and there's a power around that because it says that if you can control the way it's seen, you can control its meaning. And I think museums with permanent collections, which maybe struggle with that, that's where, activities or projects like what you're doing can really at least destabilize or try and destabilize that and begin that process.
What really struck me, Royce, what you were saying about like testing kind of the actual physical limitations of the museum. It's really interesting because I think the reason that that happened is that at least like museums are so much built around a specific way of transferring knowledge and producing knowledge, is that they don't actually leave themselves much space or room to bring in different things. So then when you do try to do it, the actual physical space is like, no. So I think that's actually really interesting because it just goes back to that it's not even just about the ideologies, but it's how we've actually constructed the entire museum, we've almost like kind of like locked ourselves into like a corner, right? How do we
Yep.
how do we get out? And like, yeah, maybe we just do need to take a hammer and do Killmonger style, smash it.
Yep.
And this
Pitt Rivers Museum does not
this
endorse
special.
smashing the glass in the museum. But
Smashing the glass in the museum, yeah. That is a fine way for me to lose my job. That's great. But yeah, I mean, and again, like going back to what I said about how kind of the idea of like the sensory, I mean, I think in all your presentations, that's what really like struck me, because we don't really have that, right? As you said, Daisy, everything's filled in these glass cases, and we can't like there's no sense of touch, smell, or any of this. That being said, if you do smell, you might not want to smell all of the objects.
But this is the question: what happens when you do?
Right? Yeah, exactly. Like what happens, and which is interesting how uncomfortable the idea actually makes, or they like it in theory, but when it actually happens, there's this kind of pushback.
Well, yeah, and because those sensory experiences are often a result of bringing it to the museum. So, you know, it's not like it exists elsewhere. Like, you know, smelly shells exist everywhere. But once you bring it into a confined space, this is what happens. And, you know, it really makes you realize, so what is the reason for doing this? Why are we doing this? You know, what does this tell about ourselves? And why do we need to be caught in these processes? And it's very uncomfortable, like, and quite disturbing, because it really challenges our preconceived ideas of like what we consider valid or valuable.
Yeah, exactly. And like, why do we expect it not to smell once it's in the museum space? Like, that's so interesting to me. Like, what, you know, it's okay if we're on like the beach or something, the seaside, that's fine. But then why do we think this will not have the same kind of smell and effect when you move it into a museum space? And that's because we really do think of museum spaces as these almost sterilized kind of, you know,
it's purely about the visual, and you just go there, consume it visually. It's got a controlled sense of experience and meaning, and that's being controlled specifically for a viewing consumption. And so, but you know what happens when like you open the museum door and you get a rush of like stinking fish, and like
I'm sure
it blows your expectations. Yeah,
Eiko could tell us a lot about the smelly fish.
Yes.
I use your autumn salmon video quite a bit in presentations about kind of, you know, how it makes me think differently about the salmon skin boots in the Pitt Rivers Museum. Especially because, like, I mean, you go through the entire process, right? You skin the fish, you clean the fish, you skin it. And I remember the first time I showed it, I didn't show it, like, I thought, you know, this is something everybody needs to see. And the first reaction I got after showing this at a lecture was that should have come with a warning. It was very bloody. And I was like, well, how do you think fish gets cleaned?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's like what you were just talking about was exactly how I started my work with this autumn salmon project. When I kept coming across with fish shoe, you know, protected in a glass case. I couldn't touch it, I couldn't smell it, but I was so desperate to try it on. And the only way to try it on was to spend 2 years so I can, you know, have a budget to like come to Hokkaido from England and spend enough time to stay here so I get to know the community, all of that. And, you know, to make a pair of shoes would require 3 salmon. And if you buy them in a supermarket, it will cost like £200. It's very expensive. And also, you know, initially I wanted to make a kimono made out of salmon skin, which requires 60 salmon. But for what I heard from people in Nibutani was that like each year they have to apply to fish from local government otherwise they get fined for illegal fishing. So, just to make one kimono is like such a big challenge. And also elders who had skill to make salmon skin kimono are dying. So, there aren't many people with those skill set. So, we don't know those knowledge by just looking at the object in a museum, but it's such a fascinating story. So, I think about how can bring in those story in, attached to this amazing object in a museum.
Yeah, I mean, then that, like, when you talked about how expensive it is for salmon, and you do have that one line when you're typing on top of the autumn salmon video, when you talk about, can you buy a whole salmon in your local supermarket? I always talk about that line because, like, I don't think people, like, sometimes people don't get what you're actually saying. One, it is very expensive, and if you don't have the rights to, like, fish, but also the fact that, like, no, I can't really buy a whole salmon in my local supermarket. My salmon comes, like, filleted and packaged and sliced. So what happens if you can't even get that? Then you can't actually continue this cultural practice, right? Because you can't even get the whole salmon skin. And, like, brings you back to the idea of museum as a space of activism, right? Which I think comes much more across when you can actually kind of feel and sense things instead of just reading it on a label. And yeah, and I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit more about kind of the recent issues between kind of the Ainu and commercial fishing rights.
So I'm not an expert of this aspect of the Ainu culture, but at the end of 19th century, Ainu people lost rights to hunt, fish, and speak their language, and basically continue their traditional culture and the ways of living. So if I'm walking by the river with Ainu people, someone will just like appear out of like bushes and say, guys, you can't like catch fish, that's illegal. And we have to say, we are just walking, we are not gonna catch fish. And it's that sensitive still. And there are some group of Ainu people trying to get their fishing rights back, but it's been 20, 30 years since one person started challenge this new policies. So as much as the government is starting to support the protection of Ainu culture, it doesn't go with the reality of how the Ainu culture used to operate around the law of nature. So there's still a big process to change. And also in terms of, Daisy was talking about sensory knowledge, and I often feel like there's a hierarchy in what information is more valuable. So when it comes to a narrative of the Ainu history, often there's a story of hardship and very difficult past, which is of course very important stories to tell. But when it comes to fishing rights, the majority of narrative is Ainu people used to live in harmony with nature. But if I talk to Ainu elders, they will always tell me, no, there were some bad people who just caught fish secretly. So it's not all like beautiful or dark. There's a lot of nuanced narratives. And and then I find those nuances very important. Sorry, I sort of tried to avoid talking about fishing rights because I'm not an expert and I don't want to say anything wrong. But yeah, I find it just, narratives that have different aspects and angles. That's the important part to me.
Well, and I guess that's basic. I think that's what partly, as you said, what like Living Matters Project is trying to do, right? It's trying to give these multiple kind of views and aspects around like same or similar stories. Because I think again, we usually kind of write these labels at this kind of very generalizing. Yes, you know, definitely a lot of times when we talk about source communities or indigenous peoples, it's
no.
Thank
So
you,
it's our
Marenka.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Eiko.
gonna end the
Thanks,
Thank you,
Eiko.
everyone.
Well, thank you for that amazing talk and the incredible chat that's been going on in the background of questions, of comments, of links. It's really amazing to see the vibrancy of what's going on in response to those great speakers that Marenka invited in. We do have some questions for Laura and Marenka. Hopefully you're both there. I'd like to start with one from Maya Sharma, who asks, what do you know about audiences, your audiences, beyond them being quirky and uncanny, i.e., do you know these works deepen their engagement and develop their knowledge about museum collections? I guess it's a question really that's saying, why is it important to work with artists and how do you know?
Lara, do you maybe want to talk more about kind of from an evaluation standpoint? Because that also seems of where that question is coming from. Like, how much do we know, feedback do we get from our audiences?
Sure, yeah, I think on the work that we've just installed in the museum, we don't have that data yet, partly because we installed it over the summer and then we were allowed to open for a month and a half and then had to close, and then we were open for 2 weeks and had to close. But we are actually going to be approaching the people, because this time people had to book their tickets, and we've had quite a bit of first primary school and secondary school people come into, and also some of our students come into the museum. We are actually just starting with one of our team an evaluation project on this. So some of that is only going to be become more you know, it's going to pan out later on, but we do know that entering contemporary art in the museum has been this amazing way to unlock stories in the museum and unlock different readings of the museum. And we've done quite a bit of that, you know, even, you know, long before I joined the museum about 5 years ago. And I know Andy knows a lot more about sort of the work with contemporary artists, but we know that when contemporary artists, and especially when they're artists from, you know, the global south or indigenous artists, they have this really important engagement with the museum, and that usually unlocks stories for all of our audiences, but especially for some of the audiences that are the most, you know, really important to us. And I'll try and find, and I'll put it in the chat, this quote from one of the people who worked with us that sort of indicates how seeing that kind of work in the museum and the work that is being developed is so important to them. And this is from Dan Lauren, actually, who's a Métis Native American. Sort of, when we had a meeting recently, he was talking about how important it had been when he came to the museum with his dad, and they had been seeing sort of objects of Métis objects in the museum, and his dad wrote to him excitedly, sent him a text and said, "They have our nation's objects here." And then later on, the museum actually started working in the Beyond the Binary project that Andy and others lead, and Beth is also involved in. And he recently in a Zoom meeting sort of said, "Oh, don't mind me, I'm just crying here on Zoom. Thank you so much for connecting Indigenous people with these pieces. It's like visiting an ancestor for me." And so it's the sort of new work that we are starting to build with communities and often with contemporary artists that actually is unlocking these stories. And I think that programming for specific audiences is extremely important in that. So not thinking that we can just program for everyone, but actually, and that goes back to a question that's also asked, I think, by Andrea Potts, where she's asking about sort of the audiences. How do you actually cater to different audiences?
I was going to ask that question, Andrea's question next, actually, Lara. So perhaps I can revisit that, because I think there's a little bit more to what Andrea asked as well. So Andrea said, Marenka mentioned embracing the notion of challenging audiences and encouraging them to feel uncomfortable, while not treating the museum's audiences as monolithic. How is this possible? How can the museum address multiple audiences in this way? So I guess there's two parts to it. Can you actually address everyone out there, and how uncomfortable are you allowed to make people feel?
Well, I definitely think like that's extremely daunting in all cases. I think it's made even more daunting by the fact that we think that everything that's on display or our interpretation has to resonate or reach or connect with everybody who walks through the doors. I don't think that's not possible. It's never possible. You know, everybody, as I said, like walks through that doors differently, and they will kind of connect with something completely differently. So in that way, you get to move away from the idea that however you're trying to kind of communicate with the audiences always has to be the same. And you can try new things and different things. Some might work, some like won't work. But I think it's just, you constantly kind of have to be brave and just keep on trying. And as Lara said, like if you do kind of pockets of things targeting maybe specific audiences, then you can see how that works. And then maybe it might work in a different format. But I think it's just, we just really have to get away from the idea that, again, as I said, that you have to resonate. Everything has to resonate with everybody. That's just, yeah.
Just to add on to that, Andy, I think building on what Marenka is saying, we do know, however, that the Pitt Rivers Museum can be a really uncomfortable space for people. And I think that I'm not sort of necessarily talking about people being uncomfortable because of the work that we've just done by installing these new interpretations, but actually people just coming into the museum feeling like they can't breathe, that they actually want to get out. And that's often people who come from that side of empire that sort of suffered its violence, often indigenous people, often people who have roots in Caribbean, other parts of that used to be sort of the part of the British Empire, or were colonized by the British Empire. And I think that is something where we're trying to find ways to see how can we actually, do we need to warn people? Do we need to somehow engage with that, so that at least what we've done now with the new installations that have been installed now, and that Marenka has worked on as a sort of interpretation, and myself and others in the museum have worked on, we sort of at least acknowledge that there is uncomfortable histories in the museum, that the museum itself can feel very uncomfortable. And I think that is, and then, I'm sure from the reactions that we've had to some of those changes, there's people who feel uncomfortable with change, and they feel uncomfortable with some of the language that we've used either in our press releases or in the museum itself. And that's what we're also going to be doing more research on.
Thanks. I've got a question now from Tamina Goska. We know, you can see from looking at the chat that there's a lot of colleagues from the museum world have tuned in to this, not just people from museums, a lot of other people as well. But clearly there's a lot of thinking going on in museums across this country and the world at the moment about how we embrace these changes and how we make changes in our museums to continue our relevance into the future. So Tamina asks, to what extent do you feel existing documentation standards, including databases and vocabularies, helped or hindered your work interrogating language and developing your decolonial methodology? I guess that's a question for Marenka, but it might be for Lara as well.
I guess it's very much does hinder the work, because when you think about it, that's kind of the framework which you have to enter while learning more about these objects, at least within the museum setting. The first thing I usually do is search the database. But if the database is, or I should say all documentation
But if the language they use in there is problematic or leaves certain things out, then it makes that whole process extremely difficult. It takes then even that much more work to start. First, you kind of have to start unpacking the words and categories and taxonomies and everything that's used within that database. Once you unpack that, then you have to think about all the things then that have been left out, which is just a whole another layer of story and research that you also have to do. And that is something that actually we talk a lot more about in the part 2 of this conversation that'll happen on the 24th. But it's, as I said I think in the Q&A, it's very much kind of reminds me of what Royce and Daisy were talking about in their presentation about, accidentally breaking the museum, because it's like how do you kind of work in a decolonial way when the actual the structure and in this sense the structure is kind of that documentation standards and guidelines were never conceived to for people to think in that kind of way, and so you can only do so much decolonial work until you come up to a wall without actually having to you have to dismantle those standards to begin with.
Great, thanks. There's a question that's just come in from anonymous attendee. In fact, there's quite a few questions, but I think it's worth touching on. But actually, it's a really, I don't know what the answer is, but it's a really interesting question. How far does or is there a risk that the use of artists allows curators and/or museums to hide from addressing uncomfortable or difficult collections and histories? Is it a way of getting someone else to do your dirty work for you? I don't know, maybe that's not the question. But
I'm happy to speak to that, because that's actually been my point always in ethnographic museums who do that they just let the artists do the work and the contemporary artists do the work. I think we do the opposite. We're actually really trying to make sure that we're doing the work ourselves also, and not just platforming artists or platforming contemporary artists to do the work for us. But we work very closely with each other so that our practice is being changed and our practices are being actively changed because of the work that we're doing, but also we are being challenged and by the contemporary artists who are working with us. So I think that's a crucial question and a very good one. And I do think that it does tend to be this sort of, we've given you the floor now. Same with working with Indigenous people, that when you're just platforming Indigenous communities, there's some of the and maybe less now, I'm not sure, because I've not been so much, but I know that in the Quai Branly, some of the work that was done with sort of some of the exhibitions was very much that you would hand over the museum to some or another community and you're actually very little involved. That seems respectful, but it actually doesn't challenge your practices and doesn't change the museum from within.
Can I just say, continue with that question? Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And for example, the way at least that we try to approach it is the video essay that Royce did for the opium case intervention. That's the second part of the intervention. The first part is really it is interrogating our own label within that case and breaking it down and basically showing all the ways that we are the ways that we produce knowledge, all the way that we're privileging Eurocentric knowledge, and also kind of erasing entire histories. And so it very much is about our own museum practice and calling that into question. And then the kind of video essays and interpretations after that are basically ways to explore those other histories and stories that we for all this time have kind of been obscuring. So it's very much a partnership and very much saying owning up to our mistakes and culpability.
Great, thanks. I'm going to come to a question from Nick Lunch now. Nick asks, how could community authored videos be better used in museums, and perhaps specifically in the Pitt Rivers? How could community authored videos be better used in museums or digitally? For example, the crafters documenting the making and use of salmonfish boots.
Do you want me to answer that one? Yeah, so I mean, I think this I mean, I just think that has to be really much like embedded within the museum. As for example, the Eiko's Autumn Salmon or Salmon Fish Boots video. I mean, I really would love that to be something that is very accessible to people within this digitally, but also within the museum space. And so they can kind of really connect those boots, you know, behind this like glass case to what, you know, Eiko is actually crafting. She's making it around her own foot. That being said, you know, there's also a lot of concern about, you know, putting up more screens in museums and how that, you know, might detract from people actually like looking at the objects. But, you know, I say partly to that, those boots have been there for a very long time, and how many people have actually engaged with them because they're in a case with, you know, 20 other kinds of shoes from all over the world. And, you know, it was only through Eiko's video that I really started to engage with them and kind of saw them in a completely different light. So yeah, I think there needs to be a way that we can balance that. But I think that whole entire kind of process of making also kind of puts people back into the museum and reminds you that there are, you know, people around and behind and, you know, these every single object that's in the museum.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think it's exactly the sort of work that we're weaving into the museum more now. So in the last couple of years, you know, obviously Nick is from Inside Chair, and we've been working for a long time together, so it's not very useful for me to answer that question because he knows what I think about that. And that is that I think it's a really great opportunity, especially for communities who, like the Maasai, who've been extremely well trained by a particularly video making organization like Inside Chair to make their own videos. But also we're looking at how do we, you know, having the museum so full of objects, and especially, you know, the Pitt Rivers Museum is very unique in that sense. We don't have like a whole gallery for one object like other museums might have, where we're looking at how could we layer that information? Could we bring more information in? So we've been experimenting with augmented reality also and bringing that in as added layers to the objects. On the other hand, we do know that there's only so much time one can spend in a museum. So it should be something that is quite impactful if at all possible, because we know people stay for about 84 minutes or so in the museum. And usually they're so overwhelmed by what they're seeing and then choose what they want to see. So I think that is why we always try to make sure that we have a huge amount of resource also on the website. And I think that's what the Pitt Rivers Museum for a long time actually already is quite well known for, that there is that enormous resource on the website, which is another bit of it is a thing that we are struggling with, because some of that resource showcases some of the problematic attitudes towards, you know, heritage of others and language, etc. So actually with Marenka, we're now also doing a one of her interns, right? Marenka is actually doing a sort of audit of that, but it's so much that it's sometimes quite daunting.
Yes. Yeah, I feel very bad for like foisting a lot of that work on her, because yeah, they're the microsites basically of the museum, and just like going through them, even just briefly, it's just, I was like, oh wow, that is deeply problematic. And then the problem is like one of those sites then have multiple links and pages, and so it's like literally you have to kind of keep on digging and digging until you realize you spent all this time on one site, like on one of the microsites, and just it's partly kind of terrifying and scary that the fact that this has been here for everyone to interact with online, and you just realize that's the information that is out there, and that, you know, when you think of like that's not something that you really want to be, especially if it's not really properly contextualized or anything. And so yeah, a lot of work needs to be done.
And on that point, I think we must draw things to a close. Hopefully, well, I think that's been, you know, we can see that this is an ongoing conversation. This museum does not have the answers any more than any other museum does, but there's an amazing journey to go on to ask the questions and see where museums and the role that museums can play in our contemporary world. Thank you for attending this evening's event. Please do fill in the survey. It really helps us improve future events. And a massive thank you to Marenka, to Eiko, to Royce, to Daisy, and of course to Laura. And thanks to Liz at Torch and my colleagues Beth and Brittany, who kind of help out behind the scenes and don't get seen. And of course, thanks to you for coming along, because there has been an awful lot of you. So thank you very much for coming. Our next event will be part 2 of this conversation, focusing on practical decisions in the museum, and will take place on Wednesday, the 24th of February at 5 p.m. Tickets are available online at the moment, so please do book in and rejoin us in 2 weeks' time. Thank you and good night.